Now the second move here I want to consider is knight to c3, which has a merit of either playing f4 or bishop to f4. Well, please remember this: whenever your opponent plays knight to c3, instead of our last bishop to b4, this time we are going to play bishop to c5, and it's very logical, because you know sooner or later the f4 is coming, and in that instance this bishop will be a very strong on this diagonal. So please remember this: whenever your opponent plays knight to c3, it's time to play bishop to c5 instead of bishop to b4. And here white has a two reply. First reply is the f4 straight away, which has a merit of attacking the knight. In this instance, black has to play knight to c6, and now you can see all the dark squares up till the g1 has been controlled by this lovely bishop. So here in one of my game, my opponent plays bishop to c4, and I responded with the d6, and my opponent played over here knight to f3. I played bishop to g4, which is kind of provoking move because this bishop is pinning that knight. So it's but obvious response from the white is h3, and now we are dropping this bishop back to e6, and the whole idea is we have weakened the white's king side. So in this game my opponent captured this bishop, and after I recapture, he plays queen to e2. So idea is very simple: he wants to exchange my good bishop with his somewhat bad bishop. So I played knight to f6, and now indeed bishop to e3 came. Now bishop e3 has two ideas. Not only it wants to exchange the good dark square bishop of the black, but if white wishes, then white can go for the queen side castling. And here I played the strongest move of the game, which is bishop to b4. It's amazing that this one move and white is in dilemma, because if white goes queenside castle now, then I can simply snap up that knight. So that's why my opponent needs to take a time out to defend that knight. So my opponent plays bishop back to d2, but again that lost one tempo, and I plays queen to e7, and after he castle on the queen side as expected, I simply castle on the same side, so I castle on the queen side as well. And now my opponent plays a3, attacking my bishop, and probably he thought that I have to drop my bishop back, but here comes a big surprise to my opponent, because I give up that bishop because I see these amazing tactics. So now white has to forcefully capture with the bishop, and now comes knight to h5. Now knight to h5 has two merits. Knight can go to the g3 square where it can fork rook and a queen, and the big merit is knight is attacking the loose pawn on the f4. So in the game my opponent defend both the threat with queen to d2, but after rook h to f8 he realized that he cannot protect that pawn anymore. So in the game he decided to play f5, but after very simple e cross f5, e cross f5 and rook cross f5, he thought that he can win a piece by g4, but he completely overlooked that his own knight is hanging. So in the game I simply capture this knight, and after g cross h5 you can see black is emerged with a clear pawn up, and not only that, white has a double pawn on the h file. So that is one game which illustrate how you can play when your opponent play knight to c3 and f4. Now in the second game, instead of f4, my opponent decided to play bishop to f4. Now when your opponent plays bishop to f4, there is always a good place for this knight which goes to the g6, which has a merit of attacking that bishop, and that's why bishop has to drop back to the g3. Here the usual line continues with the move d6. In this game my opponent plays bishop to c4 and I place knight to f6, and now he dealt off his last piece with knight to f3. I simply castle on the king side and he did the same, and now I place bishop to e6, again neutralizing the c4 bishop. And in this game my opponent decided to play bishop to b3. So it has an idea that if I capture that bishop, then he can recapture with the a pawn and the a file will be open up for his rook. So nevertheless, I continue with queen to e7, and now my opponent plays rook e1, so protecting that pawn, and probably in the future white can think of pushing that pawn forward. So I played over here knight to h5, attacking that bishop, and now my opponent responded with knight to a4, counter-attacking my bishop. But if you calculate properly over here, there is a one sequence which is very good for the black. So I first of all capture this bishop, and my opponent captured my bishop, and now I simply capture that knight, which at first glance looks very awkward because you can see I have double c pawns, and after white recaptured with the h pawn, the whole idea of doubling the pawn reveals because I place c4. So now you can see that bishop has only one square left, and after bishop to a4, I first of all attack the white queen, and when the queen goes to the e2, I simply play queen to b4, and now you can see that bishop doesn't have any square to go. So in the game my opponent tried b3, but after very simple b5, my opponent plays a3, but I can simply drop my queen to the a5, and now that bishop is a goner. So that is one game which highlight how you can handle the positions when your opponent plays knight to c3 and bishop to f4. Now the third move here which I want to consider, which is a very aggressive reply by white, which is f4. So immediately attacking the knight and grabbing the space. Here I recommend you should play knight to c6, and the whole idea is to play bishop to c5 and gain access of all the dark squares. Now there are many replies here for the white, but if your opponent allowed to play bishop to c5, then the black's game is very good. So I am only considering the two options which stopping black to play bishop to c5, and those are bishop to c4 and bishop to e3. So let's see each by turn. So first option I'm considering is bishop to c4, which indirectly is stopping bishop to c5. Let's see what will happen if black plays bishop to c5. So if bishop to c5 here, then the very simple will be bishop cross f7 check, and after king cross f7, white regain a piece with black king has been misplaced. So please don't do that. Please don't play bishop to c5 when your opponent plays bishop to c4. So instead of bishop to c5, black has a stronger reply, which is bishop to b4 check. And here again white has a two reply. If your opponent plays bishop to d2, then I recommend you give this check, which somewhat misplaced white king side pawn. So very obvious response of the white will be g3, and now you play queen to e7, so which has a merit of attacking the e4. The game which I have played in this line, my opponent responded with queen to f3, so defending that pawn, and I responded with knight to f6, so renewing the threat. And now there is no satisfactory way to protect that pawn except bishop has to go back to the d3, so my opponent decided to push that pawn. Here I played d6, so please note that pawn is spin, so I have using all sorts of tactics to that pawn. And here my opponent plays bishop to b4, so which has merit of two pieces are attacking the knight, so I simply defended with bishop to d7, and now my opponent captured this bishop, which leads to a position which is very dodgy for white. So after black recaptured the bishop, white captured this bishop, and after knight captured this bishop, you can see there are two threats are looming. So first is this pawn can be captured, and the second but the more obvious threat is knight cross c2. So my opponent has to defend that threat. So my opponent plays knight to a3, but after that very simple will be d cross e5, and here my opponent castle on the queen side, but here again I castle on the queen side, and now you can see again my knight can capture the a2 pawn and give a check, so my opponent has to defend that threat. So my opponent plays king to b1, but afterwards I simply play e4, and not only I have a passer on e file, but black clearly emerged with a pawn up, and finally I managed to win this game. So that is one sample line which gives you an idea how you can play against f4 and bishop to d2. Now after bishop to b4 check, 90% of the time I give you guarantee your opponent is going to play either knight to d2 or c3, and they both will be transposed to each other. So in this game my opponent plays c3, and after bishop goes back to the a file, my opponent plays knight to f3, and now again we are back on the track, bishop to b6. So again we are controlling those dark squares and stopping white to castle on the king side. And here my opponent responded with knight to g5, so directly attacking the f7, which I defended with knight to h6, and now he just go for it. So he plays queen to h5. Now before queen to h5, if your opponent greedily grab more space with the move e5, then there is a very good reply, which is d6. And now if white capture that pawn, then there is a very good gambit idea by black, which is to castle on the king side at this point. And if your opponent again greedily capture the pawn, then black has this wonderful check, which is rook to e8. And after a very natural reply, bishop to e2 and queen cross c7, you can see not only white is stopped to castle on the king side, but it will take an edge to get these pieces out of the file and castle on the queen side. And meanwhile black can build up a serious attack on the center. So I recommend that whenever your opponent plays e5, you should certainly play d6 and gambit the pawn. So in this game, after knight to h6, my opponent responded with queen to h5, which has a merit of attacking the f7, but I simply castle on the king side. And now here my opponent sacrificed two pieces for rook and a pawn. So he played bishop cross f7, and after rook cross f7 and knight cross f7, I simply capture that knight with my knight. And now my opponent plays knight to d2, and I played queen to e7, so which has a merit of pressurizing the e pawn. My opponent's queen dropped back to the f3, and now I place d5. So again, taking advantage of the fact that white king is in the center, my opponent pushed forward, so he played e5, and now I place bishop to f5. Please note, white cannot capture the d pawn. If queen greedily capture the d pawn, then after rook to d8, let's say queen goes to somewhere, let's say queen to f3, we can play rook to d3, again attacking the queen, and after queen backs to the base, the queen to d1, black has this lethal check, which is queen to h4, and afterwards white king will not survive longer. So that's why in the game my opponent, instead of capturing the d pawn, decided to play knight to b3, and I simply play rook to d8, and now my opponent plays bishop to e3. So now his planning is very simple. He can go either on the king side castling or the queen side castling. But I wonder if my opponent has seen my next move. That is very amazing and very beautiful knight sack, which is knight f cross e5. So please note, this knight is attacking the queen, so white response is pretty much forced. So white plays f cross e5, but after very natural queen cross e5, that bishop has been attacked by two pieces. So my opponent has to forcefully go for this king lift. So my opponent plays king to f2, but afterwards I place again amazing move, which is bishop to g4. Please note, the queen cannot capture the bishop, otherwise queen captures e3, and that leads to disaster for white. So in the game my opponent decided to play queen to g3, trying to exchange the queens, but after very simple bishop cross e3, the white position is lost, because if the king goes to the f1, then after rook to f8 check, white king will not survive long, and in the game my opponent capture this bishop, but after again rook to f8 check, my opponent realized that he lost the queen. Queen to f3, but after very simple bishop cross f3 and g cross f3, you can see black has a queen against the rook, and I won very easily. So that game illustrates how you can play when your opponent plays f4 and c3 or knight to d2. Now the second move which I want to consider with stop bishop to c5, which is bishop to e3. So you can see this move is directly stopping bishop to c5, but nevertheless if bishop to c5 has been stopped, then we can always play bishop to b4 check. And here white has a two genuine reply, either c3 or knight to d2. Again they will transpose to each other. So let's see, white plays c3, and here we'll play bishop to a5, and now at this position white has a three genuinely good reply, which I have highlighted by the arrows over here. Now if your opponent plays bishop to d3, then the very simple will be the d5, and now if your opponent plays e5, then the very simple will be d4. So attacking a bishop, the very initial reply by the white will be bishop to d2, so unpinning the c3 pawn, but afterwards we can play bishop to b6, and you can see our bishop has been posted on a very nice diagonal. Also I have highlighted where the black pieces can be placed, so this will be a very easy game for the black. So that's why bishop to d3 doesn't create any sorts of problem for the black. Let's have a look at another move, which is knight to f3, and most of the time if you reach this position your opponent play knight to f3. Against this I recommend you should play knight to f6, so attacking the pawn, and here most likely your opponent is going to respond it with knight to d2, developing a piece with defending the e pawn, and now we are going to play d5, so renewing the threat, and now white has to forcefully play e5, attacking the knight, and now we are going to play this knight to g4, so attacking the bishop. Now white has a very tricky idea, so white can play bishop to g1. So planning is very simple. White wants to play h3, and when the knight moves away, then the bishop will come back to his original place. But here we can respond bishop to b6, attacking the bishop, and white has to capture this bishop, where here we will recapture with the a pawn, and now you can see black is threatening to come to the e3 square. So in this game my opponent defend that threat with the move queen to e2, and now I simply castle on the king side, and now as you expected h3 came, and now my knight dropped back to the h6, and now my opponent decided to play a3. So idea is very simple. My opponent wants to castle on the queen side, so first of all I played rook to a4, which has a merit of attacking the f4. So my opponent defended with the move g3, and now I place knight to f5. So once again attacking the g3, so my opponent defended with queen to f2, and now I place queen to e7. It's stopping any b3 movement by the white, so my opponent decided to castle on the queen side as expected, but he completely overlooked my next move, which is rook cross a3. Bam! There is no point if white is not going to capture that rook, so my opponent grabbed the rook, and after queen cross a3 comes with a check, my opponent plays king to c2. Here I place very accurate move, which is the move d4, attacking the c3, and now my opponent played knight to e4, so defending the c3, and I first of all capture the c3, and after knight recaptures I give this check, so I played knight to b4 check, and after very natural king to d2 I give the another check, so rook to d8 check, and after king to e2 I played queen to b2 check. Here my opponent blocked the check with the rook, and I simply snap up that rook, and after knight takes I simply snap up the knight. And now you can see my threat is very simple. I want to play knight cross g3 and forking king and a rook. So here I think my opponent was in time trouble, so that's why he stopped this threat by queen to f3, but that will fork the king and a queen. So knight to d4, and the queen is a goner. Even though let's say my opponent doesn't fall for that, the black's position is very, very wonderful. So that is how you can play if your opponent responded with bishop to e3, c3 and knight to f3. Now the third move white can play here is bishop to c4, and against this I recommend you should play queen to e7, so attacking the e pawn. And the very natural way to defend this pawn is to knight to d2, where we can play this move, which is d6. And in this game my opponent decided to quickly go for the queen side castle because he thinks that he has a space advantage on the king side. So he played queen to f3, and here I responded with knight to f6. So idea is very simple. If he were go to the queen side castling, then I can play bishop to g4 and grab the exchange. Of course my opponent has to stop that, so opponent plays h3, and now I castle on the king side. And here he plays knight to e2, developing a last piece, and now I played rook to e8. So you can see now three pieces are pressurizing the e pawn. So in the game my opponent decided to play knight to g3, so defending one more time, and now I simply place d5, attacking the bishop. Please note that pawn cannot move, otherwise bishop will fall. So that's why in the game my opponent defended the pawn with bishop to d3, but after very simple knight cross e4 and knight cross e4, I place this very good move, which is f5. So you can see that knight is going nowhere. In the game my opponent decided to play queen to e2, so getting off from that f3 square, but I simply captured the knight with the f pawn, and after bishop to b4, which has a merit of pinning the knight, I simply place queen to h4. So again attacking the knight, which my opponent defended with queen to f2, but now comes a big surprise, which is d5. So now that bishop has been attacked, and if the bishop moves, then the e pawn will go forward. So in the game my opponent captured the pawn, but after I launch a vigorous attack with knight cross d5. So please note my rook is hanging, and in the game my opponent greedily captured this rook, but afterwards I simply play e3, and you can see white position is almost lost. Not only black will regain two pieces for a rook, but black has a thrown in white's camp, which is this monster e3 pawn, and that helped me to win the game. So that is how you can respond it if your opponent plays bishop to e3, c3 and bishop to c4. Now fourth and the last move which I want to consider is bishop to f4. So attacking the knight. Please remember this, whenever this knight is attacked by the bishop, you need to play knight to g6 and counter-attacking the bishop, and most of the time bishop will drop back to the g6, and now you can play knight to f6, so which has a merit of attacking the e pawn. Please note, if your opponent plays knight to c3, then you can pin that knight with bishop to b4, and the resulting position will be very much favorable to the black. So in this game my opponent responded with knight to d2, and here I responded with bishop to c5, and now he plays bishop to c4, and I simply castle on the king side. Now a normal player will play knight to f3 in this position and probably go for the king side castling, but to your surprise knight to f3 it's not possible at this point. Why? Here comes white. So if your opponent plays knight to f3, then you can simply play d5, and that attacks the two piece, and if bishop captures, then knight captures, and the position remains the same. So most likely your opponent is going to capture with the pawn, but afterwards rook to e8 creates a great nasty threats for the white. So at this position knight g to f3 is not at all good for the white. So in this game my opponent decided to play queen to f3. So idea is very simple. My opponent want to go to the queen side castling, but I responded with rook to e8, and after very natural queen side castling I responded with the move d5. Please note, my idea is very simple. I want to play bishop to g4 and gain the exchange. So my opponent spot that, and he played bishop to e2, and now I simply played bishop to e6, so protecting the d pawn. And now here my opponent responded with h4. It's very obvious because when the opposite side castle is there, both the sides will go for the flank attack. After some calculation, I decided to play queen to e7 and meeting h4 with the d cross e4. So right now white doesn't have any time to capture the knight because his queen has been attacked, and in the game my opponent captured that pawn. Afterwards I captured the knight with my f6 knight. At first sight it looks very suicidal because can't white can simply snap up that knight, but that is exactly what I was hoping for, because after h cross g6 I simply played queen check, and after very natural looking bishop to f4 I simply snap up that pawn. So after all this tactics, black defended the piece and regained a pawn. Here my opponent decided to play knight to h3, and this is a critical mistake because here I simply snap up that knight, and after very natural looking rook cross h3 I simply played knight cross f2, and you can see that forking two rooks. So in the game my opponent plays rook to g3. Probably he was relying on these tactics that he can save his rooks, but after black's next move he realized that what kind of danger he is in. So I played queen to e6. Now there are two threats, so black can capture this bishop and also black knight can capture the rook. So the only forced reply left is to rook to e1. Afterwards I place rook to d8. Rook to d8 doesn't look like a very attacking move, but in fact it has a big venom inside. After very natural looking white's reply rook to g5, which has a merit of attacking my loose bishop, I wonder if you can spot the amazing move by black. I give you a few seconds, try to find a very good move by black. And the move is bam, queen cross e2. Please note, this queen has captured a piece, and not only that, is trying to capture the under rook with a checkmate threat. In the game my opponent captured this queen with his own queen, but after rook cross e2 my opponent cannot capture this rook because at the end mate is threatened. So in the game my opponent decided to take away his rook from the firing line, so he played rook to f1, but after knight to e4 I defended not only my bishop but it also attacked the rook, and after all this black emerged with a clear piece up, and here my opponent resigned. So there is one entertaining game in bishop to f4 line which will highlight how you can play for the win as a black position. After watching all my games, I can confidently say that none of the white's reply after d cross e5 and knight cross e5 creates any kind of serious problem to the black. Black can always look out the theory which I have recommended in this video, get a good position out of it. As a black, you should be very happy when your opponent plays d cross e5 because that allows you to equalize early in the game.